Hello and welcome to the lecture Reflecting and Philosophizing on the Universal Schema. My name is Peter Hollitzer and I am the Development Manager of the Universal Schema. This lecture highlights the importance of the Universal Schema. I begin this lecture with a philosophical thought on the interpretation of universality. Only if universality does not preclude any exclusion of possibilities and encompasses the entire phenomenal world events, does universality become meaningful. The word universal schema is not a widely known term. Therefore, I will explain this first. The universal schema is a simple mental model with which we can represent and explain the relationships between phenomena. It is obvious that the quality of the explanation of phenomena depends on our experience and knowledge. The universal schema does not create truth, it creates clarity. If there is even one phenomenon to which the universal schema cannot be applied, then the universal schema is wrong. I will now briefly introduce the essential features of the universal scheme. The ideas underlying the definitions of the aspects of the universal schema of process, function, structure, and framework are banal. They say that structures create processes. Events are periods of time in which something happens. Functions explain why an action happens. The framework conditions shape the relationship between structure, process, and function. Four plausible hypotheses justify the construction of the universal scheme. The first hypothesis is the structure-process hypothesis, which states that a structure creates a process and that the execution of a process depends on the structure. The second hypothesis is the process-function hypothesis, which states that a process gives rise to a function and that the function explains why a process happens and shows the possibilities and facts created by that process. The third hypothesis is the function-structure hypothesis, which states that the explanation of why a process happens determines the meaning of a structure, and that the meaning of a structure is tied to the function. The fourth hypothesis is the framework relationship hypothesis, which states that the framework and the relationship between structure, process, and function shape each other. A simple example shows how the practical application of the universal scheme works. The example is that living beings take in food to sustain their bodies. Living beings are assigned to the structure because living beings produce processes. One process that living beings perform is the intake of food. Therefore, food intake was assigned to the process. The reason why living beings need to eat is related to their function, to build and maintain their bodies. The prerequisite for food intake is that sufficient food is available. I will now say something about the development process of the universal scheme. About 20 years ago, I studied with Prof. Dr. Walter Dohr, studied at the Free University of Berlin. Professor Dohr held the chair for business education in the Department of Educational Sciences. His research interest was in the work of Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, with the aim of applying theories of self-control to the field of education. As part of this research, Dohr developed a model that schematically represents the concept of self-control within the framework of the theory of self-organization. This model showed me what a universal scheme could look like and inspired me to develop one myself. The appeal of solving this task was to realize the utopian idea of a single universal thought form that encompasses the entire phenomenal world events, to make it an applicable thought form that manifests itself in the universal schema. The development process took about 20 years and was an open discussion process from the beginning, in which I grew into the role of development manager of the universal scheme. In 2011, I published the book, The Global Mindset, Outline of a Universal Scheme for the Unified Representation of Processes, which I presented at the Leipzig Book Fair in 2012. The publication of the book, the lectures, and the workshops have led to people from different backgrounds and educational levels participating in the discussion on the development of a universal scheme. Therefore, it is not possible to identify the ideas of individual people in the universal scheme. When I was a member of the Pirate Party, I raised the question of whether it is possible to make political demands on the basis of a universal way of thinking. The discussions have shown that this is hardly possible, since political demands are often justified with ideological, moral, or religious worldviews in order to make sense of them. Ideologies, moral concepts, and religions each convey their own specific distinctive values, and in this way create difference. The universal schema does not convey any values and therefore does not create any difference. It therefore has no ideological, moral, or religious significance, and therefore cannot be exploited for political or other purposes. The universal schema can be used to illustrate and explain differences between different ideologies, moral concepts, and religions. I would like to point out that the universal scheme is not exclusive and can be used by anyone. Therefore, the use of the universal schema as an instrument for exercising power is, as far as can be seen today, excluded. I now come to the possibilities of testing the universal scheme. Using the phenomenon of climate change as an example, I will show what a possible representation concept could look like that discusses climate change from the four perspectives of the universal schema. This discussion is based on questions that arise from the possible assignment of the term climate change to the aspects of the universal schema. I am not an expert in the field of climate change, so I do not analyze the individual aspects of climate change, but demonstrate how knowledge about climate change can be systematically structured using the universal schema. The quality of the representation and explanation of climate change depends on the objectives and knowledge of those who model climate change using the universal scheme. If climate change is attributed to the structure, the following question can be asked. What processes are caused by the structure of climate change? The answer to the question lies in describing the processes caused by climate change. For example, one process could be the rise in average temperatures. The function explains why something happens. One can ask the question why average temperatures are rising and what possibilities and facts arise from this. The answer to this question is the description of the events and processes that occur in the process of increasing average temperatures. What framework conditions shape this relationship? One hypothesis is that CO2 influences the climate. We can assign the term climate change to all four aspects of the universal scheme. If climate change is assigned to the process aspect, the following questions can be asked. Which structure produces the process of climate change, and which function triggers this process? What framework conditions shape this relationship? The following questions can be asked when climate change is assigned to the function aspect. Which structures produce a process that triggers the climate change function? What framework conditions shape this relationship? If climate change is assigned to the aspect of framework conditions, then the following question can be asked. What relationship between structure, process, and function does the framework of climate change shape? In the same way, we can represent and explain all phenomena that we observe or perceive. We can only say what cognitive value a universal representation of phenomena will have once we have had corresponding experiences. I now come to the end of my lecture. The development of the Universal Schema was an unprecedented undertaking involving many people. The requirements for the development of the Universal Scheme are met. The Universal Scheme is simple and easy to use. At this point, I would like to point out once again that we, all of us, as far as I can see, have no experience with the application of the Universal Scheme because nothing like it has ever existed before. Essentially, we all start from scratch, which makes the Universal Scheme a project among equals, with people who are completely different. A detailed explanation of the Universal Schema with application examples can be found on the website www.universalschema.info. Thank you for your attention.